We are undergoing an industrial revolution in shame. New technologies have radically expanded our ability to make and distribute a product. The product is our judgment of one another. As in past industrial revolutions, the mass manufacture and use of a product previously available to just a few or in small amounts has given us the power to do harm at a previously unthinkable scale. These are written by Salvatore Schiavone in an article that he wrote for the New York Times called The Industrial Revolution of Shame. And as he continues on to write, he talks about the way that we feel in our society, in the world where the internet has given us a platform for anything we want to say or anything that we want to think. We feel obligated to be opinionated, right? We have opinions about things that decades ago we never would have had opinions about. And we feel obligated to share those opinions, and we have the invitation to share those opinions because of this opportunity that we have. We have a platform like we've never had before in human history. He says that outrage is strange bait. It can feel wrong not to take it. We feel outraged about things, we feel emotional about things, even joyful about things that maybe before never would have crossed our minds. They never would have been something that we would have responded to, but now we live in a day and age where we respond to everything. We have thoughts and opinions and beliefs about everything. It goes on in the article as you read it, and I recommend you do. It's really one of the best articles I've read this year, to talk about the difference between a witness and a jury. In a court of law, the witness sits in a box, and their job is to answer questions given to them by the attorney. So an attorney will be asking them questions. They will respond to those questions with information. And they're supposed to give simple information, informative answers to those questions. The jury, on the other hand, is supposed to receive that information, categorize it, catalog it, synthesize it, and then pass down a verdict as a result of the information that they receive. We spend more time in the jury box than we used to, and less time in the witness box than we used to. We spend more time passing down a verdict on things that we may or may not be educated about, or things that we may or may not have been asked about, right? We spend a lot of time in this jury box. Well, in the season of Lent, our family of churches has committed ourselves to the Sermon on the Plain, which is this little section in Luke chapter 6 that explains to us some of Jesus' most key teachings. It's actually really succinct, it's really, really clear, and there's not a lot to say about what he says because what he says is really, really clear. And so we've been reading it in its entirety and then talking about one section at a time, and tonight you may have guessed that we're talking about his section on judgment. Do not judge is what he says at the beginning of the section. He says it somewhere else too. In Matthew chapter 7, he says it in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, do not judge, very simply. And he doesn't really elaborate as much on it as he does in Luke chapter 6. Jesus says, do not judge. Which is sort of weird when you read it at first because you're thinking to yourself, well, we've learned from an early age that judgment is a good thing, right? Some level of judgment and discernment is a good thing. My kids are learning at an early age that along with the assets of this neighborhood comes some liabilities. And so one of the liabilities is that nobody stops at stop signs in our particular neighborhood for whatever reason. So we live at a four-way stop. Our kids have learned to go all the way to the very corner of the sidewalk and stop and look both ways. And if there's a car coming, they don't jut out in front of it, assuming that they're going to stop at the stop sign. My kids stop and wait to see if that car's going to stop. Because we've seen accidents happen right in front of our house. We've seen people totally disregard the laws. And so our kids are learning discernment. Our kids have also learned the hard way that for whatever reason in the alleys and sidewalks around here, there are lots of sharp things. So either broken glass or thorns. And so they've stepped on a lot of those things. And we don't play in the neighborhood without shoes on anymore. They've learned that the hard way. They've learned to be discerning. They've learned to have judgment. Judgment can be a really good thing. So what is the kind of judgment that Jesus is talking about? Well, he cuts to the chase and he tells us right away in the following sentence. He says that we should not judge. And then in this old rabbinical practice, he says by reiterating it with a new word exactly what he means. Do not judge. And then secondarily, do not condemn. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't use the word condemn very often. I haven't used it maybe in a long time. I think the last time I used it was in reference to a house where somebody had cooked meth. Usually it's in like something that is like, dilapidated or falling apart. And we're like, well, that should be condemned. But when else do we use that word? So to condemn is to write off. As a lost cause. Something is hopeless or expelled or rejected. To condemn is to pass final judgment. And that's why Jesus makes it clear. He's not saying don't be discerning, don't judge, don't be unwise about your surroundings, but rather what he says is don't condemn. Don't pass final judgment from which there is no turning back. Don't say, well, that person or that political system or that ideology or that moral way of thinking or this or that, those things are lost causes and I expel them. I want nothing to do with them and I will never have any sort of reconciliation with them. So what Jesus is saying when he says do not judge is do not ever give up on the possibility of reconciliation. Do not ever give up on the possibility of reconciliation. Now, reconciliation takes many forms, and I want to be really clear tonight that what I'm saying is not that there's always a reconcilable ending to every conflict, okay? So I want to be really clear on that. So if you're in some sort of a conflict and it feels irreconcilable, that is okay. You're not necessarily doing it wrong. So the ending will look different for a lot of different people. But on the whole, what Jesus is saying is never give up on reconciliation. Now, you might remember a couple weeks ago when Phil Owen was here. Phil is red hair, red beard, pastor of TNL that meets on Tuesday nights. He was here and he talked about loving our enemies, okay, which is another difficult teaching that Jesus gives to us in the Sermon on the Plain. And at the end of his teaching, he asked us a couple questions. The first question he asked was, who opposes you or who's an enemy to you? And I, to be honest with you, I had a bit of a hard time writing down anyone's name. I couldn't really think of anybody off the top. And it's not because I'm likable and huggable and all that. I just couldn't think of anybody for whatever reason. And as I thought of it, I just kept feeling stumped. But then he had another question right on the heels of that. And the question was, is there anyone who opposes this church, the Sacred Grace Inglewood? And immediately, without skipping a beat, I wrote down 3 names. And then as the weeks have gone on, I thought of even more people who don't really like what we're up to here. And have even been vocal about that, have even confronted me about our church and this community and the work that we do here in Inglewood. You may or may not have known that. I don't know if you knew that there are people in our community that don't like everything that we're doing here. I mean, if you were here last week, we talked about the 3rd anniversary, and it probably seemed like everything was sort of up and to the right. Everything's great. We're doing awesome. Everything's fun. That's true, but we find ourselves in moments of conflict. There are people who do not like and therefore oppose what we do. And I realized something when I got to this text. I realized that I have been judging those people. The kind of judgment that Jesus says not to do. I have more or less condemned them. Because in my mind, I had written them off as people who will never come toward us in any way. They will never compromise in any way to be more like us or to be more aligned with us. What's more, and this is the interesting thing about judgment, it's a two-way street. Because in writing them off and in condemning them, I also condemned you and myself. I wrote us off as a church as a lost cause. Because in my mind, I also said, not only would they never come a step towards us, but we're not going to come a step towards them. We're not going to make any progress in their direction. We're doing our thing. They're doing their thing. We're going to go our separate ways. And I had passed subconsciously final judgment on those people. Who is it in your life maybe that opposes you or that you oppose? And have you passed some kind of final judgment on them? There's just no way we would ever have any sort of relationship. Now, right on the heels of that, Jesus gives us the antidote to the thing. Like I said, this teaching from Jesus is really, really clear. He just says, don't do this. Here's the antidote to that. Do this instead. And then he moves on to the next thing. So it's really, really good stuff. He says right on the heels of that the antidote to judgment is forgiveness. Forgiveness is the antidote to judgment or condemnation. To practice forgiveness. But forgiveness, let's keep in mind, is not to forgive and forget. There's no such thing, right? There's no such thing as just simply ignoring the things that have happened in our life and forgiving nonetheless. Rather, what we do is we forgive and we remember. We remember things, we know things, we have objective eyewitness information about things, and we choose to extend the grace and mercy of God regardless. That's what forgiveness is. It's actually a lot harder than forgiving and forgetting. Forgiving and forgetting would be a lot easier if that were even possible, right? But what we do is we forgive and we remember. This is the antidote to judgment according to the teaching of Jesus. I want to end our time, just a couple thoughts here on not so much the antidote to judgment, because I think that's actually kind of clear, not only in his teaching but in our minds. What I want to talk about for just our last minutes here is rather the root of judgment. I want to go the other direction. Jesus kind of teases out this idea. Here's what you do instead of judging, and here's how it might look. And in the way that he describes the speck in someone's eye and the log in your own eye, and there's great material there. But I want to ask a question in the other direction. What is the root of judgment? When you judge someone else, when you pass final judgment and say there is never going to be a reconciliation between me and them, there'll be no redemption of the relationship. When you pass that kind of judgment, what is the root of that? This is something that my wife and I experience on occasion in regards to our children. So most of you know, if not all of you, know that we have been working in the foster care system for several years now. And the kids who come into our home come from other homes first, okay? I think that might be obvious to you, but they come into our home from another home and another family, and they have been separated legally from that family. They've been removed from that family. And what we hear people do, whether they mean it or not or realize it or not, is they pass judgment on the biological parents of our children. Because the assumption is if you lost custody of your kids, you must be a terrible person, or you must be a violent person, or you must be a neglected person, or you must be some sort of monstrous person that did not love their children. And I can tell you without a doubt in my mind that the biological parents of our children deeply and desperately love their kids. I can't speak for all biological parents for all of time, but I can tell you this, that time and time again, our experience has been that biological parents love their kids. We've sat through two TPR, termination of parental right hearings, and watching the rights of a parent terminated is one of the most gut-wrenching things I have ever witnessed in my entire life. It means a step in the right direction for us because it means we might get the opportunity to adopt this kid. But I want to make it really clear that we're not rescuing them from people who don't love them. Rather, we get to keep them, and they are no longer with people who were not equipped to love them well. That's a huge difference. Loving and being equipped to love are not the same thing. And people pass condemnation or final judgment on these biological parents all the time, and that is rooted in an assumption. An assumption without knowledge, without real information. A judge can make a determination about the rights of that parent because the judge sits there and gets all of the information. Or if there's a jury present, they get all the information, and then they can say, we condemn this person's rights. They can do that because they have all the information. But we, so often, without knowing anything about anybody, pass final judgment, don't we? Some sort of condemnation. Kevin and I were talking this week, and we realized that this kind of goes beyond moral judgment, right? We oftentimes judge other people based on their morality or their choices that they make, but this actually goes into philosophical judgment too, doesn't it? Because every one of us in this room has written somebody off because of the letter in parentheses next to their name when we're watching the news. Or the candidate who's on the ballot, we see that letter and we're like, nope, not for me. I don't want anything to do with them. I want nothing to do with their ideology because we live in such a politically polarized world, right? We pass final judgment on a philosophical level with other people. I was sharing with someone the other day about the philosophical diversity of this church. The interesting thing about philosophical diversity is that it's invisible, right? You have no idea what the person next to you thinks or believes. And I think that's great, mostly because I know a lot about each of you because we get some good time together, and I know what you think. And sometimes I see two people sit next to each other that would wildly disagree on anything and everything, and it's like you have no idea. And I think it's hilarious from up here, and you have no clue, and it's wonderful. Or I'll see people join a table group together, and I'm like, oh, this is great. They have no idea that they don't agree on just about anything. And it's amazing to see how that is actually okay. Because you see, this reconciliation, this ability to stop ourselves from judging and condemning, it starts right here in this room. It starts with the people you're sitting next to. It starts with the people in your table group that you don't agree with. Because as we practice it with each other, we'll be able to practice it out there. We'll be able to practice it with the people that don't agree with us, whether it's on a philosophical level or a moral level. Jesus is clear. He says, do not judge, which means do not ever give up on the possibility of reconciliation. Again, I know that this isn't possible for every relationship and every conflict. We can talk more about the nuances of it some other time. But on the whole, the recommendation, the teaching, the hope, the command from Jesus is to never give up on the possibility of reconciliation. We cannot condemn and write people off as lost causes, but rather there's always hope, or almost always hope, for reconciliation if we're willing to take a step, and hopefully that person is willing to reciprocate. That is what it means to follow the way of Jesus. That is what it means to follow this particular teaching of Jesus, is to see the people around us as people with whom we may be able to reconcile. The differences are actually opportunities. The things where we disagree are actually an avenue or a conduit where we can make relationships, where we can come part way and someone else can come part way, and we can experience reconciliation. It's possible, it's doable, and it starts with me, and it starts with you, and it starts right here in this room, and then it's something that we can do out there. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, thank you for an opportunity to gather together. We thank you for your word and how clear and concise this particular teaching is. We thank you for the ways that you've used the Sermon on the Plain to shape us and to mold us throughout the season of Lent. I pray, God, that as we have thought about those particular people or institutions or relationships that are broken because of some sort of judgment or condemnation, that we would seek out the reconciliation through forgiveness that you've put before us tonight. Pray these things in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.